Peace, King. How you feeling?
I'm great. How you doing?
All is well. All is well. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you stopping by and taking out the time to drop some of that knowledge on us.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh yeah, most definitely. For the viewers who may not recognize you, let them know who you are and definitely where you're from and what you do.
Well, the short version is that my name is Kwasi Konadu. I'm a professor of African history, African studies, scholar of African history and African diaspora histories, and I'm also a publisher at the Diasporic Africa Press and the indigenous healer, among other things.
Okay, that's real cool. Now I have to ask you this. When did you develop this passion for history and African history and the diaspora? Is this something that you were kind of raised on, or did you kind of get into it later in life?
Actually, both. And this is to your previous question. So I fold them into one. So I was born in the island of Jamaica, raised there until I was about 11 years old, migrated to Brooklyn, New York, and have been a Brooklynite for most of the time since then. And so, really, this entry into African history was, in one sense, was baked into me already. I was raised not by my biological father, but by my grandfather and my mom. But my grandfather played a pivotal role because he was a healer as well, and he introduced me very early on to some of the rituals, the language, the ideas that permeated African cultures, African spirituality. And then came to find out that on my mother's side, which is how I trace my lineage, my ancestry through my mother's line, there are, including my grandfather, there are Maroons. So I'm also Maroon by way of my ancestry, particularly from the Maroon town of Akompong, which is in the western part of the island, Jamaica, in the parish of St. Elizabeth. And so at 18 years old, I began to take a deep dive into my family history, what I called then my family history project, collecting photos, data points, whatever I could find in scratch archives, interviewing elders in my family, great aunts, uncles, etc. And essentially that kind of boiled into what became the more formalized academic version. So in a sense, my cheat code for African history has been my own family's history. And in many ways, I've used my entryway and the skills I've gained from working on my own personal and family history to sort of, dovetail into the craft of doing African history and African world history.
Wow, that's really amazing, man. So many people take history for granted, but like you say, just stepping into, your own family history can be very, very empowering. I'm glad you shared that for sure. Now, you had mentioned being a publisher. I wanted to ask you what exactly is a publisher and why is publishing important for authors? Because you hear about publishing a lot, but more so on the music side. Is it any different or is it something similar?
Sure, I'll tackle the first part first, which is about book publishing, and then I get to sort of comparison between that and music. And there are some overlaps, but some very important distinctions. So I got into the book publishing because I was frustrated with what was being offered by both academic and trade books when it came to African and what I call African world history, because African peoples are global peoples. And the first diaspora is an African one in terms of the scattering and population of the world that we know today. And so when we think about world history, it's really an African foundation and infrastructure that makes everything else afterwards take the shape and texture that they do. And so African world history, the frustration came is that I was not seeing the kind of narratives and stories and ideas coming out of that African world history perspective and lived experiences for that much. And so, as some of you viewers may already know, there are African peoples, people of African ancestry that have been in the Eurasia, that is Europe and continent of Asia, for millennia. And they have not only pockets, but they have large and extended communities. And so, I'm intrigued and fascinated by the spread and dispersion and settlements and movement of African peoples throughout space and time. And that led to Diasporic Africa Press in 2010, not just maybe a month or two before my daughter Ifia was born. And so the press and her shares some certain sort of symbiotic relationship. Nonetheless, the press was born out of that frustration, lack of African perspective and stories and ideas, and the need for these global African histories to be narrated, but also not narrated, but also to be taken through the process, because you have a lot of publishers who publish really trash, but it sells, and because it sells doesn't mean that it's something that is nutritious for the mind and the soul. And there's some comparisons here with music, because with music there is publishing rights, of course, right? Meaning the sort of control and authorship in terms of claims to who owns, right, the particular music, from the lyrics to the actual composition, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, there are residual incomes that come after that publishing in terms of what licensing that thing. So publishing books work the same way. Only thing is that in music and books, they're both telling stories, but the medium for it, whereas the book is a physical item, the music, of course, is more it's oral. It's more a certain kind of energy and a feeling that it carries and hits you with. Whereas a book, of course, is a physical thing that can give you a feeling. Because I like reading books, the physical copy rather than a electronic book. I'm old school that way, because there's something about the feeling of it. So again, there are some overlaps with book publishing and music publishing, but the publishing that we do is with books, and we are a global publisher of non-fiction books about African histories, cultures, language, literature.
Wow, that's really dope, man. I appreciate that. Now I can ask you this. You had kind of mentioned it about black people being global. So I wanted to ask you, I guess, what exactly is the African diaspora? And a lot of times it's a two-part question. So a lot of times when I hear people speak about the diaspora, they kind of talk about like North and South America, maybe Europe, the continent, but they don't a lot of people don't really go into India, Australia, the Philippines. Are those people included in the diaspora as well?
Of course they are, because as I said a moment ago, the first diaspora, that is from the Greek word to mean scattering of seeds, basically dispersal of peoples, and essentially these various kinds of migration that led into populating the world that we know today, the planet today. Those were laid with an African foundation, no question about it. The archaeology is very clear that the oldest skull remains and other human, both book fossils as well as human implements and tools, that is human culture, material culture. The earlier dating of all of these through a process called carbon-14 dating, which is only one of several processes of dating materials. The oldest remains are found in Africa, and the more ancient they find them, they're all found in one place, right? So it's not Eurasia, it's not the Americas, it's not Oceania, that is over in the Pacific. It's in the African continent. And so the oldest skull remain that's found is a skull remain of an adolescent boy named Tumai in Niger, which is basically Niger, for those of you watching, is northwest of Nigeria, northwest of Burkina Faso, and it's straddled obviously other countries to the north and to the east. And so Niger, which is in this case is in West Africa, right? And that, of course, puts a wrinkle into the story that, well, African peoples came from the Nile Valley, which is ancient Egypt or Kemet and so on. That story doesn't hold water, because this skull remain was dated 7 million years old. Denkanesh, also called Lucy in popular culture, dated just after 3 million years old. Adolescent boy, 3.1. And so twice that amount has been found in Western Africa, not Eastern Africa, Valley, which means you got to rethink what we think about, African movement and migration, and therefore where we find African people. And so African peoples are found everywhere in the world. In fact, there was a United Nations report that came out a few years ago that indicated that African students, as one subset of African peoples, are the most global students in the world. They're studying in war zones like Ukraine and Russia. They're studying in China. They're in all these places that you would not normally contemplate or consider African peoples being. And so that note from the UN just simply confirms the more ancient and earlier stories of African people's movement and settlements throughout the world. So yes, African peoples are not only conveyed into the Americas by way of transatlantic slavery and their own free movements in some cases, but there are also these movements and populations of people. In fact, this may shock some of your viewers, but there was researchers, I think it was Nottingham University, I could be wrong, but scholars in England, the UK, a few years ago, and this was published in Science magazine, the results, so y'all can check it out, where they found some DNA material from a fossil that was dated to about 10,000 years ago, and they reconstructed, this person, which is a male, based on DNA and other evidence, and the person looks like you and I in Europe. 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, so people who are Anglo-Saxon or who are the Teutons, which are the ancestors of the British English people, or the Gauls, ancestors of French people, all these people, in some cases, look like you and I 10,000 years ago, which is like yesterday in terms of historical time, right? And so we have to rethink a lot of what we assume or believe to be in terms of, again, this global population of African people. So yes, the reconstruction, the hair, black hair, semi-straight or not, the skin complexion, deep brown, and the eyes were blue, which of course makes sense because we have African peoples that have blue eyes. This reconstruction of this man, 10,000 years old, that was found in England, shows again from the evidence, DNA evidence, genetic evidence, that is material evidence and other evidences that were found in this reconstruction at 10,000 years ago, which again is yesterday. It's not ancient history. People's there, of course, they're in mutation, and we're all mutations, right? You and I are mutations from our parents and their parents' genes. And so the mutations are always underway, but to have a reconstruction that suggests very strongly that the people there had not become pale skinned as yet, right? 10,000 years ago suggests that there was a more ancient and older populations that gave birth to this particular individual, and therefore they were part of a community of people. And just imagine what the world looked like, right? If that's the case in that portion of Northwestern Europe, Northwestern Europe, in England, imagine other parts of Europe, particularly the Nordic region, that we consider to be, and definitely in the South, like Spain, all the way east to Italy, they tend to be of a browner shade, right? Or what we consider to be quote unquote white, which is a symbol for power, but talking about complexion, which is pale. So that evidence there just shows once more that this African diaspora, this dispersal of African people, is not only ancient and deep, but it's also very recent.
Okay, man. I appreciate you breaking that down. Most definitely. Now I wanted to ask you about some of the books that you have. Now, which book is your most recent? Many Black Women of This Fortress.
Yes, that one is the most recent. Came out last year, and as well as there's a book that was published by the British Academy at Oxford University Press. I think Portuguese sources for Africa's Gold Coast, which we can talk about if you like. So those two books were published last year. Those are the most recent.
Yeah, definitely. If you could just talk about what inspired you to write each of those books, and how long does it take you to write, books like that?
It varies. And I'll give you an example, starting with the last part of the question to come back to the first. So in terms of taking the length, it really varies. So for example, my book, Transatlantic Africa, which was essentially the first book to retell the story of transatlantic slaving. And that too is global because I included the Indian Ocean in that one, right? Which is not usually included. It's Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean actually bleeds into the Indian Ocean, right? There's no great wall that separates these oceans, these waters, and that's, I think, is an analogy for African people's movement. That the wall that we create, that this is Africa, that's African history, this is not African history. That is foolishness because people move, right? And just because they move doesn't make them less than who they are. And so that book retold that story through African people's voice and perspective. Meaning, I had gone through archives, various languages, and were able to recover over 5 or 6 dozen of these African narrative slaves. And so they tell their story. I'm simply this sort of, orchestrator, right, of that story. So that book took me to write 3 months, right? Now, I have a process. So that's really not the full story, because the process, if that's what you're asking me, is that I never write until I feel comfortable with the sources, right? That takes me longer. So my process is pretty simple, which I've outlined elsewhere, but I'll give you the short version of it, which is that I sort of vacuum any and all data points, right? Oral, written, visual, whatever data points I can get to answer certain essential questions that I lay out for myself in terms of the project. And when I vacuum up all that, I sit with it, right? I meditate on it. And that book in particular was very tough because I'm writing about people's being torn and ripped apart from their natal families and communities that they'll never see again. And very few are able to go back. And there's a few that were able to go back, and even then not to their particular homelands, right? So, and you're in Madagascar, so there are Africans who came to across the Atlantic from Madagascar, particularly in the 19th century, right? Places like Brazil and South America, and a few came to the U.S. South as well. And so that book was tough to write because of I'm dealing with people's lives, but also just the weight of it, dealing with trauma and dealing with grand trauma at that, right? What W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as the most magnificent story of the last 1,000, 2,000 years. And so gathering information, processing it, sitting with it. What I do is I try to cook it as many ways as possible. Barbecue, fricassee, stir fry, meaning I look at it at a different angle, different perspective. And once I do that and I'm comfortable with, all the angles that I can see and make sense of, then I go about the process of writing. When I start to write, writing for me doesn't take long because I've done most of the legwork, right? It's like cooking. Once you chop up all the seasonings and you have all the ingredients you need, you've already cleaned if you eat meat, you clean everything and you season everything. The cooking part is really simple, right? But it's the preparation. And so my prep is long and time consuming as it has to be because I'm sitting with real people's lives, whether they're in the flesh or in the spirit. To me, that's how I manage and handle these lives, right? And so that's my overall process. And for these last two books, they took years because one is source materials that takes a lot of time and has some collaboration with some other folks in Portugal because these are Portuguese sources, but also some folks in Brazil and some folks in West Africa. And but ultimately it rests on me because I'm the one in charge and my name on the book. And so I have to hold responsibility there for many Black women in this fortress. That took years too. Started with one Inquisition file, Portuguese Inquisition file of this woman named Graça that was dated back her trial was in 1540, right? So she's one of the first African and first, woman of African descent to stand in front of the very new Portuguese Inquisition. And so it started with her file and it kind of led into, okay, I may have something enough for a book here. And so that one wasn't planned, but as you know, I take my cue from the sources. So if I can see a story, I can see the story being more than just a one-off for an article or for a book chapter, then I just go with the rhythm and the flow of that story. And it led to that book. And it led to the sources book that we have. And so that's my process. And those are the two books that came out of that process.
Wow, okay. I appreciate you sharing that because a lot of times as readers, we take for granted the work that goes into a historical account like that because we just looking at it like, okay, the author just doing all this writing, but I'm sure you might have had to go to some archives, you might have spent hours reading documents, you got to email people, and you got to, like you say, double check your resources because you don't want to put anything in there that might be, false or untrue. So I really appreciate that effort. Now I can say this: I got a chance to study abroad in Brazil, and that was really like a eye-opening experience, man. Because me coming from America, like a lot of African Americans will say, like, "Oh, we do this dance or we sing like this," and we look at it like from slavery on. But in Brazil, they'll say this dance comes from the Congo, this martial art comes from Angola, this spiritual practice comes from the Yoruba people. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm. Indeed. And so there's some of us, based on where we were dropped off, when I say we, I mean lowercase we, because we're not our ancestors, even though they certainly ride with us and live in us through our bloodline. So I'm saying lowercase we. So when I say we, I mean those ancestors, they had memory and connections based upon where they were deposited, but also based upon the sort of the structure of the neo-European colonies, whether it's Brazil, Peru, Colombia, or it is United States, or it's Jamaica or Antigua, or Australia, because there were Africans that were transported there in the penal colony in the 19th century, which is a little known story, by the way. There's a number of Australian researchers who have done a lot of work, historians in particular, done a lot of work, in that field. So there's that global story based upon where people are dropped off and based upon the structure. So, for example, in the English and Dutch-speaking colonial world, and therefore Protestantism is more prominent as a religious structurization, both as an ideology and as a social practice, social control practice. That is, there was little more room for one to author or dictate their story. That's why we find a lot of autobiographies and biographies, either by a Catholicist or a religious person or another kind of avenue, or even self-learned, self-taught individuals that write their stories or dictate their stories. You find them more in the English-speaking world, right? And there's a reason why we find very little comparatively in the Portuguese and Spanish-speaking world, because Catholicism was a dominant form and force, right? There was always a church in the center of the town, and it monitored and surveilled and not only what they considered to be morality and religiosity, but also social control. And so you were renamed, you were baptized, you had to go to church, and you had to walk this line. And there was an Inquisition of Terror, that is this office set up to not only surveil and monitor, but to terrorize people, to maintain a certain kind of social norm, social control. Whereas in the English-speaking world, there was no Inquisition for the most part. The discussion of it in the 17th century, 16th century, 17th century, there's some discussion of it, but no Inquisition, right? And so that's why we find a lopsidedness in the kind of narratives and sources we get about African people's experiences in the transatlantic era. And finally, we also find that where one was left off, therefore, you have different kinds of historical experience, different kinds of memories, right? That people can recall and make direct connections to. Because in Brazil, people in Cuba, people were still being transshipped and deposited in those places at the end of the 19th century. In some cases, the early 20th century, right? So we have people. In the case of the United States, the last official slave ship, it was in, I think, the 1850s, right, just before the Civil War. So we're depending upon where people dropped off and when they were dropped off, they have certain memories and therefore connections to real people, real places, and real sort of cultural worlds that they can relate to in a very real way rather than fictitious way.
Yeah, true indeed, true indeed. When you go from country to country, you continuously learning different things. You see some similarities, and you definitely learn about some differences. Now, I can ask you, with all of the writing and the research that you have done, have you ever considered doing maybe like a documentary?
I have. In fact, I have one book, A View from the East, which is about this cultural nationalist organization, that began in 1969, that is, and that sort of folded in 84, 85. But their impact on what I wrote about, A View from the East, and they're influential as the C Fund, which is late Mary Baraka's organization in New York, New Jersey, or US organization, Malana Karenga's organization in California. So the East was based in Brooklyn, New York, and I've done obviously the archival and research and wrote the book about them. And so I plan to do a historical documentary on that book, but I have other books that I've written. For example, Our Way in This Part of the World, about this indigenous healer and his family and his community and the colony turned nation called the Republic of Ghana today. So I plan to essentially convert the strong storylines, write the script, and then, of course, begin to put together, using audio, visuals, and narration, these kinds of documentary based upon the work that I've done. And so I have a script, maybe 2 or 3 scripts, draft version, that I'm working on. It's slow, but I'm working on it, to your question. And hopefully in the near future, I can bring these to fruition.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely look forward to seeing that, because a lot of people, I don't know if they just don't know about them, but they don't really get as much credit, I guess. Like the Mary Barakas and the Malana Karengas, the US organization, they were definitely a part of that wave of the Black arts movement and the Black power movement. You know what I'm saying? So I would definitely like to learn more about those great people for sure. Let me see. Okay, I wanted to ask you about a book. You got a book called The Ghana Reader.
Mhm. Right. So the
Okay,
Ghana
yeah,
Reader,
yeah. If you could talk about that a little bit.
sure thing. Yeah. So the Ghana Reader is really edited volume between myself and a colleague of mine, Dr. Clifford Campbell. And we put the reader together as part of a series that Duke University Press has on the sort of readers, world history or world cultures readers. And so they have readers for Brazil, for example, they have it for Peru and a lot of places. But Africa, as you might imagine, there was only one reader at the time, which was South Africa, just published. So Ghana reader, I think, was the second one in the series. And hopefully they'll have more soon. So the reader really puts together 500 years of history, culture, and politics that gives the student, the visitor, the study abroad person, they say did a study abroad earlier on, the business person. So whatever is your reason or purpose for having an interest or having, a visit to the Republic of Ghana, this reader will give you not only the fundamental, but even more than the fundamental, fundamentals of the history, culture, and politics that made the Republic of Ghana what it is today, including the people, places, and ideas that shaped it. It puts together in one place through a section of excerpt readings, plucked from articles, chapter, but also music. So, for example, there's hip hop music in Ghana, pieces that were done. Carnivals, right? We think carnival, we think of the Americas, whether it's Caribbean basin or Brazil, other places. But yes, Ghana's adopted carnival, inspired by what the diaspora. That excuse me, inspired by the African diaspora in the Caribbean. And so there's a way in which culture forms the norm since it recycle, right? And return, right? And so the reader gives really a full 360 scope of the history, culture, and politics that came to shape and form the peoples, places, and cultural norms and practices of the Ghanaian people up until the present.
Wow. Okay. Okay. That's really cool. I just left Ghana. That's where I was at. I was out there for like 9 months, man. I really had a phenomenal time. It's a beautiful place for the viewers. If you haven't been, you check out any part of the continent if you can get there. But I would definitely recommend Ghana for, the first
For
timers
sure,
for
for sure.
sure.
And a shameless plug, not to speak over you, but a shameless plug is that the Ghana Reader, even if I didn't write it, and nothing to do with it, I would still recommend it because I think it gives people a lot. Because I've used it in the classroom, in fact, because I've taken students to Benin, Ghana, and in the Caribbean, to Trinidad and other parts in Brazil. So I've taken students on sort of study abroad, but even smaller excursions. And I've used the Ghana Reader for a trip to Ghana, and it really is great. So it's a teaching tool, but it's also a standalone that can be used for anyone interested. It really will give you a solid background and sensibility. So when you get there, you are actually more than prepared to benefit from and meet and therefore maximize the time that you have there if Ghana is a destination for you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, reading something like that will definitely build up that anticipation and getting to know about a lot of things before you get there, because I went to Kamasi, Cape Coast,
Mhm.
all over, man. It was definitely a great experience. So I'm sure your students, man, it could be life changing for them. It's something that they'll remember today, 100 years old. They tell their great grandkids about, the excursions that you took them on. So I really appreciate what you're doing, man. So yeah, yeah, we're about 30 minutes in. I just want to thank you so much for coming on the platform. This has definitely been an honor. The information that you shared is powerful, and myself and the viewers will definitely check out the projects that you have now, and we look forward to what you got coming out. So if anybody want to check out what you got, do you have a website or social media? What's the best place for them to follow you and show support?
Sure thing, which is the website, www, my name, Kwasi Konadu, .info, info. And you can find the latest there. There's multimedia, there's videos, there's audios, interviews. There's a blog called African History 360, where I've included excerpts of primary sources. I frame them, put them in the context, give you excerpts. So people, actually, I've had a number of teachers from Boston, New York, and other places who use these sources in the classroom. And so whether you're a homeschooler, whether you're a parent or guardian, whether you're a student or a student of life, not necessarily an academic student, Whatever you are, whoever you are, and have an interest in African world history and cultures, there's a blog there that has a lot of resources, and I'm going to put more in the coming months. I have more of those sources up there too, people can use, and it's free, it's available for anyone. And of course, articles that I publish, there's PDF files of them. Books I published, there are the covers of the books, and there are little notation about them and reviews. And so there's a lot to check out on the site, but that's the best place probably to folks to reach out. And of course, there's Facebook, which of course young people call, for the older folks. There's that too. So I don't really do social media, but there is a Facebook page where I share information now and then. And finally, I do have a YouTube channel called Powered by Nyame, that puts history, cultural data, and genetic material to reveal some fascinating things about ancestry, culture, and African-based spiritualities and practices and rituals.
All right, all right. So yeah, man, it's been a great one. I really appreciate you. So until next time, peace.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, take care, brother.